The Hearthstone Cafe was an island of warmth on a bustling Upper East Side afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the large front windows, illuminating the rich, dark wood of the tables and the soft leather of the booths. The air was thick with the comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and baked pastries, a scent that promised a brief escape from the city's relentless pace. It was a place built on the idea of simple dignity, where the clinking of ceramic mugs and the low murmur of conversation created a gentle, welcoming symphony. Yet, even in this sanctuary, the cold realities of the outside world could intrude. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency, their genuine smiles a stark contrast to the entitled boredom etched on the faces of some of their more affluent patrons, for whom kindness was just another service to be purchased and discarded. Julian Vance was the embodiment of that cold intrusion. Seated alone at a prime table, his bespoke Italian suit was a suit of armor, his Swiss watch a testament to a life where time was money, and both were his to command. His face, a mask of bored superiority, scanned the room with a gaze that assessed and dismissed everything it saw. He was a man who didn't wait. When his coffee was delayed by a mere minute, an impatient flick of his wrist sent the full cup toppling over, a dark stain spreading rapidly across the pristine white of his custom-tailored shirt. A hush fell over the nearby tables as his voice, sharp and cruel, sliced through the cafe's gentle hum. He rose to his feet, not in embarrassment, but in pure, unadulterated fury, directing his venom at the young waitress, Mia, whose hands trembled as she held her empty tray. He called her incompetent, a worthless child, and threatened to buy the building just to have the pleasure of firing her himself. From across the room, Grace Miller watched the scene unfold. She wore the same simple uniform as Mia, her hands methodically wiping down a recently vacated table, but there was an unshakable stillness about her. Her eyes, clear and direct, took in Mia's terrified face and Julian's performative rage. She saw not just a spill, but an act of casual cruelty, a powerful man feasting on the fear of someone he considered insignificant. Without a word, she picked up a clean, dry cloth and walked toward the confrontation. She didn't address Julian's anger or his stained shirt. Instead, she placed a gentle hand on Mia's arm and spoke in a voice that was low but carried an undeniable weight of authority. "It was an accident," she said, her gaze fixed on Julian. "There is no reason to speak to her, or anyone, that way." It wasn't an apology. It was a correction, a quiet defiance that stunned the powerful man into a momentary silence. Julian's face contorted from rage into a mask of sheer disbelief. He had been challenged, not by a peer, not by a rival, but by a waitress, a nobody. The audacity of it was a greater offense than the coffee stain. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "I want to speak to the owner, now." It was a final, undeniable power play, the last word of a man who was never questioned. The entire cafe held its breath, waiting for the inevitable outcome where the small, brave waitress would be sacrificed to appease the titan. It's in these moments, watching a person's dignity being put on trial by someone with too much power, that you realize how important it is to bear witness. If you feel that same pull to see justice find its way, subscribing to our channel ensures we can keep bringing these powerful true stories to light. Grace Miller watched him leave, her expression unreadable. She felt no victory, only a profound sadness for the man whose wealth had so clearly impoverished his spirit. The cafe, once a haven of calm, was now a stage, and every customer and employee a spectator to a drama they hadn't chosen. Robert, her father, appeared at her side, his face etched with a worry that went deeper than a single disgruntled customer. He had seen men like Julian Vance before, men who treated the world as their personal chessboard and people as pawns. He knew this wasn't over. It was the quiet before a storm, And Grace, in her simple act of defending another human being's dignity, had just painted a target on the heart of their family's legacy, a legacy built on the very kindness Julian held in such contempt. The next morning, the first assault came not with a shout, but with a whisper that grew into a digital roar. A flood of one-star reviews appeared online, a coordinated and vicious attack. They spoke of non-existent health code violations, of rude staff, and of overpriced, mediocre coffee. Each review was a small, sharp lie, but together they formed a narrative of failure. Grace and her father sat in the small office above the cafe, the glow of the monitor illuminating their stunned faces. They read the fabricated stories, feeling the weight of each anonymous word. It was a modern form of warfare, where truth was the first casualty, and a life's work could be dismantled overnight by faceless assassins hiding behind keyboards, all commanded by the whim of one powerful, wounded man. The digital poison quickly seeped into the real world. The morning rush was noticeably thinner, the familiar faces of regulars replaced by empty tables. A delivery driver from their longtime bakery supplier called, stammering a flimsy excuse about logistical issues before admitting his boss had ordered him to cut ties. The air in the hearthstone grew heavy with uncertainty. Mia, the young waitress Grace had defended, moved with a nervous energy, her eyes constantly darting toward the door, as if expecting Julian to reappear. She looked at Grace with a mixture of awe and terror, grateful for her courage, but terrified of its consequences. It was a stark reminder of how easily a good reputation, carefully built over decades of hard work and honest service, could be shattered by a single act of malice. This was the world Julian Vance had built for himself, one where influence was a weapon and empathy was a fatal flaw. His sterile penthouse, with its panoramic views of the city, felt more like a command center than a home. He had spent 20 years erasing the memory of the man he used to be, a young, ambitious architect, full of ideas and a naive trust in people. That trust had been shattered when his mentor, a man he revered, stole his flagship project, presented it as his own, and systematically discredited him to cover the theft. Julian remembered the cold, hollow feeling of that betrayal, the public humiliation, and the vow he made in the wreckage of his career. He would never be powerless again. He would be the one who set the terms, the one who held the power, and he would never again make the mistake of being kind. Watching a person's life get torn apart by a lie is a terrible thing, and it's why stories of resilience are so important to share. If you agree, please consider subscribing to our channel so we can continue to bring them to you. From his perch, high above the city, Julian monitored the cafe's decline with a cold, detached satisfaction. He had his tech team set up a discreet, illegal link to the cafe's security cameras, wanting to witness the fruits of his campaign. He expected to see chaos, despair, perhaps Grace in tears. But what he saw confused him. He watched her move through the half-empty cafe with an unshakable calm. She was consoling her staff, brewing coffee herself when they were short-handed, and spending extra time talking with the few loyal customers who still came. There was no fear in her posture, no anger in her face. There was only a quiet, resolute dignity that seemed to grow stronger under the pressure of his attack. It was a strength he didn't recognize, a currency he couldn't devalue, and it began to gnaw at the edges of his victory. While Julian watched from a distance, Grace and her father faced the reality of their situation. The numbers in their ledger were bleeding red ink. In the cramped office, surrounded by photos of the cafe's opening day, Robert Miller finally voiced his greatest fear. "Maybe we should consider the offer," he said, referring to a predatory buyout proposal that had arrived that morning from a shell corporation they both knew led back to Julian. "We could start over somewhere else." But Grace shook her head, her gaze steady. She spoke of her mother, who had poured her heart into the place, who believed a business could be a source of good in a community. "This is more than just a building, Dad," she insisted. "It's a home, for us, for our staff, for our customers. We don't run from bullies." Julian's next move was his most aggressive. He bypassed the business and went for the foundation itself. Through another of his corporations, he made an offer to the building's owner, an offer so far above market value it was impossible to refuse. Within a week, a formal eviction notice was delivered to the Hearthstone Cafe. It was a cold, legal document filled with bureaucratic jargon that amounted to a death sentence. They had 60 days to vacate the premises. The news spread through the staff like a chill wind, turning their quiet anxiety into palpable fear. This was no longer just a battle of reviews and suppliers. It was a war of attrition, and Julian had just deployed his most powerful weapon, his immense, overwhelming wealth. The image of Grace's unwavering composure on the security feed became an obsession for Julian. He had built his entire life on the principle that everyone breaks, that every person has a price, a point of weakness to be exploited. Yet she refused to conform to his cynical worldview. He would wake in the middle of the night, the memory of her clear, direct gaze cutting through his defenses. He found himself trying to understand her, a person who chose integrity over surrender, who met cruelty with quiet fortitude. The desire for revenge began to curdle into something else, a confusing and unwelcome curiosity. He was a man who understood transactions, not character, and Grace Miller was a puzzle that his power and money could not solve. But the community that the Hearthstone had nurtured for years was not going to let it die without a fight. The tide began to turn, slowly at first. Loyal customers, realizing the online reviews were a coordinated smear, organized a counter-offensive. They flooded review sites with their own 5-star ratings, sharing personal stories of the kindness they had experienced at the cafe. A well-respected local food blogger, a long-time patron, wrote a scathing piece titled "The Corporate Bully on the Corner," exposing the likely connection between the sudden downturn and the public confrontation with a notorious real estate magnate. A small "We Stand with Hearthstone" movement began to take root, a testament to the community Grace had spoken of. It's in these moments, when people stand up for what is right, that you see the best of humanity. Your subscription helps us find and share these powerful turning points. Julian read the blogger's article, his jaw tightening. He scrolled through the comments, seeing dozens of people defending the cafe, defending Grace. He expected to feel rage at their defiance, but instead he felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest. It was envy. These people were fighting for something, for a sense of belonging, for a place that meant something to them. He looked around his vast, silent penthouse, filled with expensive art and designer furniture, and realized he had nothing and no one who would fight for him. His empire was built on fear and leverage, not love and loyalty. For the first time in 2 decades, he felt the profound emptiness of his existence, the loneliness of a king ruling over a kingdom of one. The groundswell of support gave Grace and her father a renewed sense of hope. They decided to host a community appreciation night, offering free coffee and pastries as a thank you to those who had stood by them. It was a small gesture, an act of defiance against the crushing weight of Julian's campaign. The cafe was packed, overflowing with a warmth and energy it hadn't felt in weeks. Standing on a small stool, Grace addressed the crowd. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't speak of the attacks or the eviction notice. Instead, she spoke of gratitude, of resilience, and of the simple, powerful idea that a community is stronger than any one person's hatred. As she spoke, Grace's quiet strength filled the room, transforming fear into resolve. She wasn't a warrior leading a charge. She was a protector, a guardian of a small flame of decency in a world that often felt cold and dark. She looked at the faces of her staff, her father and her neighbors, and she saw not victims, but a family united against a common foe. In that moment, she understood that their fight was no longer just about saving a cafe. It was about proving that a business built on respect and humanity could not only survive an assault from a world of cynical power plays, but could, in its own quiet way, triumph. The stage was now set for a final, inevitable confrontation. The night of the community event, Julian Vance decided he needed to witness the end himself. He walked into the Hearthstone Cafe not as a customer, but as a conqueror, arriving to survey the ruins before the final raising. He expected to find a somber, defeated atmosphere, a handful of holdouts mourning their inevitable loss. Instead, he was met with a wall of warmth and noise. The cafe was packed, vibrant with laughter and conversation. It was a celebration. He stood by the door in his immaculate suit, an island of cold fury in a sea of genuine fellowship. His power, his wealth, his entire arsenal of corporate weaponry felt utterly useless here. He saw Grace moving through the crowd, her face luminous with gratitude, and a venomous resolve hardened within him. He would wipe that look off her face for good. He cornered her near the counter, away from the main throng of people. His voice was a low, cutting whisper, meant only for her. "Quite the party," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "A final feast before the execution. I own this building now, Grace. Every brick, every pipe, this little display of community spirit is touching, but it's meaningless. It's over." To emphasize his point, he reached over and casually picked up a small, almond-dusted pastry from a platter, a new specialty for the evening. He held it up as if it were a symbol of her failed enterprise before taking a large, arrogant bite. He was ready to deliver his final, humiliating offer, the one that would force her to admit that his world of power was the only one that was real. The change was brutally swift. Julian's condescending smirk froze on his face, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He swallowed, and his eyes widened. He reached for his throat, a strangled, wheezing sound escaping his lips. The color drained from his face, then returned in an alarming, blotchy red rash that spread across his neck. He stumbled back, his other hand clutching his chest, his breath a desperate whistling struggle. The pastry fell from his hand as he knocked over a small table with a crash of ceramic and glass. The entire cafe fell silent as the powerful magnate, the man who had held their fate in his hands, collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing in a silent, terrifying battle for air. The conqueror was drowning on dry land. For a heartbeat, everyone was paralyzed by shock. But then Grace moved. Her mind, cleared of all emotion, became a sharp, analytical instrument. She saw the rash, heard the wheezing, and knew instantly what was happening. Anaphylaxis. She pointed to the pastry on the floor. "Almonds!" she shouted to her father. "Call 911. Tell them it's anaphylactic shock." Without waiting for a reply, she sprinted to the small office behind the counter, her movements precise and certain. She returned a moment later with the cafe's emergency medical kit, her hands already tearing open the box for the epinephrine auto-injector. Kneeling beside the gasping, terrified man who had tried to ruin her, she pressed the needle firmly into his thigh, a quiet, steady force against the chaos swirling around them. The first sensation to pierce the fog was the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Julian's eyelids fluttered open to the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room. His throat felt like it had been scraped with sandpaper, and a profound weakness pinned him to the bed. But he could breathe. As his vision focused, he saw a figure sitting in the chair beside him. It was Grace. There was no victory in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a quiet, lingering concern. He tried to speak, to ask the question that was a formless weight in his mind, but only a dry rasp emerged. She leaned forward slightly. "Rest," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You're safe now." The words, So simple and so pure, landed with the force of a physical blow, shattering the cynical worldview he had spent a lifetime building. In the sterile quiet of the hospital, Julian Vance had weeks to do something he hadn't done in 20 years. Reflect. The memory of Grace's calm, competent hands saving him, followed by the simple, profound statement, "Ah, you're safe now," played on a loop in his mind. He saw the vast, empty penthouse he called home, filled with things but devoid of meaning, and contrasted it with the vibrant community that had rallied around a small cafe. The kindness he had mistaken for weakness was, in fact, the most formidable strength he had ever encountered. It was a force that didn't just win battles, it changed hearts. He realized his entire empire was built on a foundation of sand, a monument to a past hurt, while Grace had built her world on the bedrock of human connection. The rage was gone, replaced by a deep, humbling shame and a desperate, unfamiliar yearning for redemption. 2 weeks after his discharge, Julian walked into the Hearthstone Cafe, not as a conqueror, but as a penitent. He found Grace and Robert in the office, and for the first time, his voice held no artifice, no power plays. He offered a raw, unvarnished apology, detailing the ugliness of his actions and the emptiness that drove them. But words were not enough. He proposed a partnership, not to own them, but to invest in them, to help them expand and secure their future. He wanted to use his vast resources to amplify their mission. Furthermore, he announced his intention to create the Hearthstone Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to promoting ethical labor practices and providing wellness resources for service industry employees. With Grace and her father on the board of directors, it was not a transaction, it was an act of restitution. 2 years later, the grand opening of the 5th Hearthstone Cafe was a testament to that promise. The new location was spacious and beautiful, but it retained the same essential warmth and character of the original. The Hearthstone Foundation had become a beacon in the industry, forcing larger corporations to re-evaluate how they treated their employees. Julian and Grace stood together near the entrance, their easy camaraderie a symbol of their unlikely but powerful alliance. He was no longer the hollow man in the bespoke suit. The lines on his face had softened, and his smile, once a rare and calculated weapon, now reached his eyes. He had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in stock portfolios, but in the positive impact one could have on the lives of others. As the evening wound down, Julian noticed a young barista nervously fumbling with an espresso machine. The Julian of old would have seen only incompetence. The new Julian saw a young person trying their best. He walked over, not with a critique, but with a quiet word of encouragement and a simple, kind smile. In that small, almost imperceptible gesture, his transformation was complete. He had learned that the greatest power lies not in the ability to command fear, but in the courage to offer grace. Stories of redemption remind us that it's never too late to change, and that one act of compassion can ripple outward in ways we can never predict. Your subscription helps us continue to share these powerful reminders that even in the darkest of hearts, a light can be rekindled.